The terrace smelled like coffee and sea salt. A calm I had forgotten existed. I sat still, hands around a warm cup, letting the morning exist without asking anything from me. 10 years of work, and this was my first real vacation. No laptop, no headset, no emergency cue breathing down my neck. That was when my phone buzzed. Nathan Crowell's name filled the screen. I answered out of habit. "So," he said, voice controlled. "I hear you're taking time off. It was approved." I replied. 1 week. A pause. Then colder. People who step away during pressure cycles don't belong in leadership. We need commitment, not comfort. Consider this your termination. There it was. Fired for resting. The frustration welled up like boiling water, then intensified. That was inside me. While the actual temperature outside was quite cold. How about where you are? What's the temperature like right now? And if you're still here listening with me, please leave your lucky number so I know. Now let's get back to my story. For nearly a decade, I had been the invisible spine of the company, designing workflows, stabilizing audits, keeping regulators satisfied while Nathan played visionary. I didn't take stages, I took responsibility. Nathan had no idea who I was having coffee with. Across the table, the man sitting with me waited, watching steam rise from his cup as if nothing had shifted. "Sorry about that," I said. "My CEO just fired me." He took a slow sip. "That happens more often than boards admit." I frowned at the word boards, but stayed silent. He always said I was replaceable. I added, "The man studied me. Replaceable people don't design systems no one else can run." That landed deeper than Nathan's voice ever had. He leaned back slightly. "How many dependencies fail if your approval architecture goes dark?" I stiffened. That wasn't casual curiosity. That's very specific, I said. He smiled. Knowing, specificity matters when leadership mistakes start costing money. In that moment, irritation sharpened into clarity. Nathan hadn't just fired me. He had miscalculated who would notice and who would respond. Do you know? What just happened was only the beginning. The next part of the story contains some fictional elements and uses AI to clarify the message and enhance the emotional experience. If you empathize, I greatly appreciate it. If not, I hope you have a peaceful evening and a good night's sleep. The man finally introduced himself. "Elliot," he said simply. "I advise companies when leadership becomes expensive." He didn't elaborate, and he didn't need to. The weight of the word expensive pressed harder than Nathan's insults ever had. I felt the familiar pressure return, the kind that squeezes your chest when you realize how much you've been holding alone. 10 years of being indispensable without being protected. 10 years of being told rest was weakness. Elliot listened without interrupting as I explained. Briefly, what I actually did. He didn't nod politely. He followed, when I finished. He mentioned one system by name, then another. The exact approval logic Nathan never bothered to learn. That was the moment the frustration sharpened into something darker. Nathan hadn't just taken my time. He had built his authority on a foundation he didn't understand, and now someone at this table clearly did. That realization left me silent, cornered, and aware of how exposed he was. The quiet followed me back to the hotel room, but it didn't stay quiet for long. I had just set my bag down when my phone lit up with the first email, then another, then 3 more. Subject lines stacked on top of each other like warning labels. Urgent, immediate attention, client escalation. I didn't open them yet. I already knew what they contained. The call from HR came minutes later. Polite, tight, too rehearsed. "We're reaching out regarding asset recovery," the woman said, "and to remind you of your ongoing obligations." "Which obligations?" I asked. A pause. "Papers shifting. Confidentiality, continuity, cooperation." They wanted stability without admitting they had just removed it. I ended the call and finally opened the emails. Audit preparation was unraveling. Approvals delayed. Dependencies misfiring. One message stood out. Short and panicked. Who is authorizing Julissa Pierce's workflows now? No one answered it. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling something unfamiliar replace the shock. Not relief. Awareness. My phone buzzed again. A message from the man I'd had coffee with earlier. Dinner was enlightening. It read, "I should clarify something. We met briefly in the lobby, this time. There was no pretense. My full name is Elliot Vanguard." He said, "I chair the Strategic Oversight Council." I felt the room recalibrate around the name. "I'm brought in," he continued evenly, "when boards need to understand why systems fail after leadership decisions. I've replaced 12 CEOs. The air felt thinner, louder. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Power had entered the conversation without raising its voice. Elliot studied me. "Your approval architecture is holding 3 revenue channels together," he said, "and your former CEO never learned how." That explained the emails, the panic, the sudden interest in cooperation. Before we parted, he added one final sentence, calm and devastating. "I'm scheduled to review your company next quarter." I watched him walk away, certainty settling in my chest. Nathan hadn't just fired me. He had unknowingly scheduled his own examination. Systems do not collapse loudly. They drift. I saw it first in the emails that reached me overnight, each one slightly more confused than the last. Approval queues stalled. Reconciliation flags stayed unresolved. Nothing was broken outright. But nothing moved the way it used to. By morning, the audit team missed its first internal deadline. That alone would have triggered escalation weeks ago. Now it sat unresolved, floating, waiting for someone with authority they no longer had. I read quietly, coffee cooling in my hand, feeling a low, restrained satisfaction I refused to name. Inside the company, Nathan reacted exactly as expected. He raised his voice. He demanded explanations. He ordered people to just run the process again, as if repetition could replace understanding. The system responded with indifference. Logs don't fear tone, they record choices. Another message arrived from a director I'd worked with for years. He's asking why the approvals aren't syncing. She wrote, "No one knows how to answer him." I did. I always had. That knowledge sat heavy but contained. Like a locked drawer I no longer needed to open. Late that afternoon, Elliot called. His voice carried no urgency, only confirmation. "The misalignment is visible now," he said. "Boards notice patterns before they notice people." I asked what he meant. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. The next update came indirectly, through an innocuous calendar notice forwarded by someone nervous enough to overshare. A special board session had been scheduled. Not about systems, about decisions. Elliot followed up with one final detail, delivered almost casually. He had formally requested that the board log Nathan's termination decision. Time. Approval path. Justification. Preserved without commentary. That was when the satisfaction deepened. Not triumph, not revenge. Recognition. Systems remember everything, especially the moment someone with power mistakes silence for safety. I stayed where I was, untouched by the noise, aware that no email could summon me anymore. Every delay, every unanswered question, tightened the pattern. Nathan was still shouting. The record, however, was already speaking, and it spoke calmly, permanently, without apology or urgency or mercy left. By the second morning, Nathan was no longer confused. He was strategic. I saw it in the forwarded messages. Julissa left without transition. Julissa abandoned critical duties. One email went further, suggesting I had intentionally destabilized processes before leaving. The accusation sat there, neat and damaging, designed to stick. I felt the familiar pressure tighten, not fear, but the old reflex to defend myself against someone louder. Inside the company, Nathan doubled down. He spoke in absolutes. No single employee is essential. The systems are documented. We'll stabilize internally. Every sentence was an attempt to sound in control while the ground shifted beneath him. People listened because they were supposed to, not because they believed him. A former colleague called me quietly. "He's saying you sabotaged the approval flow," she whispered. "People don't agree, but he's pushing hard." I closed my eyes, letting the tension settle. This was the phase where men like Nathan fought hardest, when the illusion of authority cracked. They blamed the nearest absence. That afternoon, Elliot reached out again. Not to reassure me, to inform me. "Nathan is pushing a counter-narrative," he said. "That's expected." "Does it work?" I asked. There was a pause. Only until the board asks the right question. The right question arrived sooner than I expected. Later that evening, an email circulated to senior leadership, copied wider than Nathan intended. It was a request from Elliot. Concise and devastating. "Please outline the specific risk exposure created by the termination of Jalissa Pierce. Include financial, operational, and regulatory impact. No accusations, no defense, just exposure." Nathan responded quickly. Too quickly. His reply rambled. He spoke in generalities, avoided numbers, leaned on confidence instead of clarity. It read like a man explaining weather instead of accountability. I felt the tension finally shift. Not resolve. Rebalance. Nathan was still fighting, but now he was fighting the record, the systems, and a question he couldn't shout down. And for the first time, his resistance made one thing unmistakably clear. He knew he was cornered. Coffee was never a coincidence. I understood that the moment Elliot called me the following morning. His tone measured, already ahead of the chaos unfolding behind him. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He didn't offer sympathy. He simply said, "I wanted to be clear about something." We met again, briefly. In a quiet corner of the hotel lounge, Elliot didn't waste time pretending our first encounter had been accidental. "I requested that table," he said calmly. "I've been tracking your work for 2 years. That landed without drama, but it landed hard." He spoke about my role the way auditors speak about exposure, not potential. He knew which workflows I stabilized, which approvals I quietly rerouted to prevent regulatory delays, which shortcuts Nathan signed off on without understanding the risk. I felt no anger listening to him, just control returning, piece by piece. "You weren't promoted because visibility frightened him," Elliot said. "You weren't protected because protection creates leverage." I didn't argue. The truth didn't require defense. Back in my room, another message arrived, then another. A major client was rescheduling an emergency review, not canceling, redirecting. The calendar update was short, almost polite. The meeting was no longer with Nathan's team, it was with Elliot. The shift was subtle, but irreversible. Authority moved without announcement, the way capital does when confidence evaporates. Nathan was still sending memos, still issuing instructions, but clients follow stability, not titles. Elliot called once more that evening. "They asked for me." He said simply, "I didn't suggest it." I looked out at the city, calm settling deeper than satisfaction. Nathan still believed this was a misunderstanding he could correct. He didn't see the pattern forming around him. Coffee had never been casual. It had been reconnaissance. And now, without raising his voice or naming an enemy, Elliot had taken control of the conversation. Nathan just hadn't noticed yet. He thought time would soften the damage, that a few firm emails could pull authority back into place. But systems respond to signals, not confidence. Every redirected meeting, every unanswered approval, narrowed his margin. I felt nothing personal about it. Control isn't emotional, it's procedural. And the procedure was no longer his. That realization arrived quietly, leaving him loud, reactive, and increasingly alone. The board meeting didn't explode, it fractured. I wasn't in the room, but I felt it through the messages that reached me in fragments. Calendar blocks disappeared, executives went silent. Then someone forwarded a single line from the Agenda Leadership Accountability Review. Nathan entered that meeting expecting theater. He spoke first, confidently, blaming miscommunication, temporary disruption, and my unplanned absence. He said my departure created risk. He said I failed to transition. He said a lot of things that sounded strong until someone asked him to be precise. Elliot didn't interrupt. He never does. He listened. Hands folded. Neutral to the point of discomfort. When Nathan finished, Elliot asked one question. Calmly. Without emphasis. Can you quantify the risk exposure created by terminating Julissa Pierce during audit preparation? The room stalled. Nathan tried to recover. The systems are documented, he said. No single individual should hold. Elliot raised a finger. Polite. Documentation does not equal operational control. Please answer the question. That was when the fracture widened. Board members leaned in. Someone asked about delayed approvals. Someone else asked why 3 clients requested external oversight within 48 hours. Nathan's answers grew shorter, then defensive. He stopped naming facts and started naming people. From where I stood, distance sharpened everything. I could see the pattern clearly now. Nathan wasn't being attacked, he was being examined, and examinations don't care about confidence. The update came an hour later. A message marked confidential, forwarded by someone who shouldn't have forwarded it. Nathan Crowell is suspended pending internal review. Temporarily. They said, procedurally. I set my phone down and breathed out slowly. There was no triumph in it, just the steady recognition of something inevitable completing its arc. Boards stop pretending when the cost of pretending becomes visible. Nathan had lost control long before that meeting. The board had simply stopped covering for him. And piece by piece, quietly, the authority he relied on had already moved on. I understood then that collapse rarely announces itself. It arrives as silence, signatures, calendars clearing, and power quietly changing hands. Without shouting, threats, warnings, mercy. The call came the morning after the board meeting, quiet and unannounced, like everything that mattered now. Elliot didn't frame it as an offer at first. He framed it as an option. We're building a stabilization unit, he said. Independent authority, clean reporting lines. I listened without interrupting. No urgency pressed against my ribs. No threat hovered beneath the words. He described the role plainly: oversight, architecture, decision rights that didn't require permission from insecure executives. The work I had been doing for years, finally acknowledged as leadership instead of support. There were no golden handcuffs, no loyalty speeches, no expectation of sacrifice disguised as culture. Compensation was clear. Scope was defined. Time off was assumed, not negotiated. I realized how conditioned I'd been to confuse pressure with importance. I accepted slowly, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted to feel the difference. Saying yes didn't feel like surrender. It felt like release. The transition moved fast. A press note followed, neutral in tone, factual to the point of sharpness. It mentioned my name, my role, and the council Elliot represented. Nothing inflammatory, nothing defensive, just placement. That was how Nathan learned. I didn't hear it from him. I read it in an industry brief forwarded by a former colleague. Former executive joins Strategic Oversight Council amid leadership review. My phone stayed silent. His didn't. By afternoon, the narrative had shifted again. Questions weren't about whether I would return. They were about why I'd ever been hidden. I closed my laptop and let the quiet settle. No alerts, no escalations, no one asking me to absorb risk they didn't want to own. For the first time in 10 years, my value wasn't being negotiated downward. Nathan had fired me to regain control. Instead, he'd announced to the world exactly how replaceable his authority had always been. And this time, I wasn't chained to the outcome. I was free to choose it. That knowledge settled calmly, irreversible and clean, marking the moment my career stopped being reactive and finally became deliberate, visible, and mine alone. Without apology or hesitation, the news broke quietly, the way real consequences usually do. No press conference, no dramatic exit, just a short internal memo confirming that Nathan Crowell was no longer serving as CEO by the time industry outlets picked it up. The language had already shifted from authority to damage control. I read it once, then again, feeling nothing sharp. His credibility unraveled faster than his position. Former allies distanced themselves. Partners declined comment. A leadership profile that once dominated panels and interviews reduced to a cautionary paragraph. Reputation, I learned, evaporates faster than power. My phone vibrated mid-morning, a message from an unfamiliar number. But the tone was unmistakable. Julissa, we need to talk. Another followed seconds later. This has gone too far. Then a final attempt. Stripped of command. Please, just call me. I didn't. There was a time when those words would have pulled me back into orbit, when I would have managed his crisis because no one else could. That reflex was gone. Accountability doesn't need witnesses, and justice doesn't require response. Through colleagues. I heard how it ended. The board cited governance failure, risk mismanagement, loss of confidence. Nathan tried to argue that circumstances had turned against him. No one interrupted. When the vote was recorded, it was unanimous. Later that afternoon, another message arrived, longer this time. Apologies layered with explanations. He wrote about pressure, about misunderstanding, about how firing me had been a mistake. He didn't write about respect. I set the phone face down and returned to my work. Silence can be deliberate. It can also be final. Nathan didn't lose his position because I left. He lost it because systems don't forget decisions, and boards don't forgive exposure. He fired the wrong person. Believing authority insulated him from consequence. It didn't. Cold justice rarely celebrates. It concludes. And by choosing not to answer, I let the conclusion stand exactly where it belonged. Untouched, uncontested, and irreversible. That quiet refusal was the final boundary. One he could not cross, rewrite, or threaten. And it closed the story without noise or witnesses standing behind him. I didn't feel victorious when everything finally went quiet. What I felt was space. Space to think without bracing for interruption. Space to work without being owned by urgency. For years, my career had been defined by reaction. I fixed, absorbed, stabilized, and moved on before anyone noticed the cost. Now the movement was deliberate. I chose meetings instead of emergencies. I chose conversations instead of commands. The work was still complex, still demanding, but it no longer asked me to disappear inside it. That difference mattered more than any title. Looking back, I understand how easily exhaustion can be mistaken for loyalty. Nathan rewarded availability, not judgment. He confused obedience with leadership, and I let that confusion shape my limits far too long. Walking away didn't make me reckless. It made me precise. The table matters. Who sits there decides which voices carry weight, which risks get ignored, which people get protected. For a decade, I was never invited to choose the table. I was expected to serve it. That changed the moment I stopped answering. He fired me for taking a break. I chose who I sit with next. That choice didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. There are moments in a career when everything collapses, not because you failed, but because you dared to stop and breathe. I used to believe my value came from always being available, always enduring, always carrying the weight others refused to hold. This story taught me a hard, honest lesson. If an organization only functions when you're exhausted, that isn't loyalty, it's exploitation. What stayed with me the most wasn't being fired. It was realizing how used I had become to shrinking myself so others could stay comfortable. I stayed silent for too long. And that silence was mistaken for consent. Only when I stepped away did people begin to understand that some kinds of value cannot be replaced by slogans, titles, or authority. If you're listening to this story, I want to ask you sincerely, if you were in that position, would you keep enduring or would you choose yourself? Not everyone needs to walk away, but everyone needs to know where their line is. I believe everyone watching this video has faced a moment like that, in one form or another. Where are you listening from right now? A quiet room? A commute to work? Or the middle of a late shift? If this story resonated with you, A subscription, a like, or a comment doesn't just support the channel. It helps this story reach someone who believes they have no options. Sharing this video might help someone rethink their situation. Sometimes, a small action from you is exactly what helps someone else find the courage to change. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.